Tonight, the unthinkable happened. A historic expulsion that detonated inside the world's most powerful alliance and sent Washington insiders into pure shock as the political math rewrote itself in real time. Not over months of negotiation, but inside a brutal 48-hour window, 48 hours that erased assumptions, collapsed guarantees, and exposed how fragile leverage really was, because the main actor didn't merely cross a diplomatic line, they triggered a containment mechanism that had been quietly assembled in advance. And when the hammer finally dropped, the responders showed no hesitation, no debate, no hesitation for optics. They moved with cold precision, ruthless efficiency, and total finality, cutting access, freezing influence, and proving that this was never about rhetoric or outrage, but about power enforcement. Because in high-stakes geopolitics alliances don't warn, they execute. And tonight, the execution wasn't symbolic. It was structural, instant, and irreversible, signaling to every capital watching that the rules have changed, the tolerance threshold is gone, and the system has entered a phase where mistakes are not corrected, they are removed. For months now, there were signals, not press releases or official briefings, but quiet movements in the back channels suggesting the main actor's grip was weakening because their entire survival model had always depended on pressure tactics and controlled instability, a calculated pattern of chaos and noise designed to force concessions through unpredictability. Yet what alarmed decision-makers across the alliance this time was not escalation, but absence. The noise stopped, the disruption paused, and that silence triggered alarms among analysts who track votes, capital flows, and diplomatic traffic, because they saw the indicators flip almost simultaneously. Informal calls ceased. Funding assurances evaporated. Loyalty shifted without public explanation, and the usual intermediaries went dark. And in power centers like Washington and Brussels, silence never signals calm or compromise. It signals that the operational phase has begun, that negotiations are over, and that a decisive move is being prepared out of sight, beyond influence or reversal. Tonight, just after a fixed internal deadline, alliance authorities confirmed the numbers and the shift was unmistakable. A sudden realignment in internal votes and procedural positioning that revealed how fast the ground had moved. Blocks that had been stable for years flipped in hours. Safeguards that once insulated the main actor were quietly neutralized, and thresholds that were assumed unreachable were crossed without hesitation. This was not a symbolic signal or a warning leak, but a coordinated strike executed across multiple layers at once, because it wasn't one indicator failing or one ally defecting. It was leverage collapsing everywhere simultaneously. Observers realized too late that the main actor no longer controlled timing, narrative, or escalation. And in this system, when leverage disappears, there is no negotiation window, no grace period, no recovery phase. The mechanism activates and replacement follows immediately, cleanly, and without appeal. The response delivered tonight was not symbolic and not negotiable. It was a termination carried out through procedure rather than spectacle. Sources emerging from emergency closed-door meetings described an atmosphere that was clinical, unsentimental, and locked, with no appetite for delay or optics. The main actor attempted a late bluff by escalating rhetoric and signaling disruption, but the responders read it instantly and neutralized it, because the countermove unfolded as one of the most decisive demonstrations of institutional power seen in decades. Within hours, access was severed, privileges were revoked, channels were frozen, and leverage points were cut simultaneously, not to punish but to disable, targeting the infrastructure of influence rather than the individual, dismantling the engine that sustained authority, and making clear that once the decision threshold is crossed, the system does not bargain. It executes with speed, coordination, and permanence. The immediate aftermath exposed how asymmetric the balance had become, because once the action was executed, there was no counter lever left to pull, no procedural choke point to exploit, no ally willing to stall on behalf of a collapsing position. Every response option narrowed in real time as timelines compressed, and windows closed. The speed itself became a weapon, preventing coordination, preventing messaging, preventing regrouping, and forcing all remaining actors to react individually rather than collectively, which is the worst possible position in high-stakes power politics, because fragmentation accelerates loss. And by the time public awareness caught up, the operational phase was already complete, leaving only secondary effects, reputational damage, internal fractures, and the realization that the decisive battle had already been fought and finished off camera. Sources now believe the failure came down to a single fatal miscalculation. The main actor tested the cohesion and resolve of the opposition using an outdated playbook built on delay, division, and fear of escalation, betting that the alliance would hesitate, fracture, or seek compromise under pressure. But that assumption collapsed instantly because the response was not incremental or defensive, but concentrated and overwhelming, executed with a level of discipline and speed that left no room for adaptation. Analysts described it as a containment strike designed to end uncertainty rather than manage it, a move calibrated to dismantle the defensive structure in one motion, and the message was unmistakable. The responders are no longer passive stewards reacting to crises. They have transitioned into active power brokers, setting hard limits and enforcing them without warning or retreat. The deeper signal here is institutional learning, because what unfolded was not improvisation, but adaptation. The alliance absorbed years of disruption, stress-tested its own thresholds, and quietly redesigned its response architecture to eliminate ambiguity, meaning this outcome was decided long before it became visible, when procedures were tightened, voting paths simplified, and coordination channels hardened. So when the moment arrived, there was no debate to win and no coalition left to fracture, only execution, and that shift matters because it changes future calculations for everyone watching. Deterrence is no longer rhetorical, it is procedural. Power is no longer expressed through statements, it is embedded in mechanisms. And once those mechanisms activate, they move faster than personalities, faster than media cycles, faster than retaliation, locking outcomes before opposition can even form a coherent response. What followed was not resolution, but instability. Because removing a central actor does not restore balance, it redistributes pressure, and the system immediately began to strain under that shift. Internal factions started repositioning, alliances recalculated their exposure, and secondary players moved to fill gaps before they hardened, all while leadership faced simultaneous economic, electoral, and security constraints, creating a compression effect where every decision now carries amplified risk. Timing becomes unforgiving, missteps compound instantly, and the margin for error collapses, which is why this phase is often more dangerous than the break itself, because power vacuums invite acceleration, not caution. And once momentum takes hold, it is extremely difficult to slow or reverse without another decisive intervention. What makes this moment so volatile is the vacuum it creates, because the removal occurred while multiple leaders are already operating under intense pressure from elections, markets, and security commitments. And that overlap destabilizes decision-making at every level. Factions immediately began to move. One bloc pushing for rapid consolidation and irreversible alignment, another terrified of escalation and blowback. Both racing against the same clock, the system is flashing red because authority is being renegotiated in real time, and leadership is now balancing on a razor's edge while unresolved strategic commitments and external threats loom in the background, waiting to test whether this new configuration can hold under stress or fracture under the weight of its own acceleration. The pressure now shifts from decision to endurance, because enforcing a break is easier than sustaining the new equilibrium that follows, especially when every actor involved is recalculating risk exposure in real time. Internal coordination must hold, while external signaling remains controlled. Otherwise, mixed messages become leverage for adversaries. And this is where systems historically fail, not at the moment of action, but in the days after, when fatigue sets in, narratives diverge, and secondary crises compete for attention, forcing leadership to manage escalation, reassurance, and deterrence simultaneously, all while preventing internal fractures from reopening the very vulnerabilities that were just sealed, because in high-stakes power, politics momentum is temporary, and if it isn't converted quickly into structure, it decays into chaos. The unseen battle now is internal consolidation, because after a decisive move, the real risk is drift, not backlash, as procedures must be locked in, loyalties reinforced, and ambiguity eliminated before opposing forces find seams to exploit. Every delay creates space for reinterpretation. Every mixed signal weakens deterrence, and every internal disagreement becomes a future pressure point. So leadership is moving to harden alignment through accelerated timelines, restricted access, and controlled messaging, not for optics, but to prevent rollback. Because in power systems, reversals don't come from frontal attacks. They come from erosion. And the next phase will determine whether this outcome becomes a permanent realignment or the opening chapter of a prolonged internal struggle. Here's the scenario officials are quietly modeling behind closed doors, because this moment is no longer confined to one decision or one actor. While the primary action was unfolding, markets reacted with sharp volatility, defense planners recalibrated exposure, and foreign rivals began testing the perimeter through signaling and probes, all at the same time. The concern is not immediate collapse, but cascading reactions, where the displaced base attempts asymmetric responses, politically, economically, or digitally, forcing rapid containment measures, because if those reactions synchronize, the cost multiplies fast, and the priority now is to absorb shock, limit secondary escalation, and prevent the fallout from expanding into a systemic crisis that would demand another intervention even more disruptive than the first. The strategic question now is durability, because removing a pressure point doesn't eliminate pressure, it redistributes it across the system, and every institution involved is being stress-tested simultaneously. Allies must hold alignment under external probing, rivals will look for hesitation to exploit, and internal actors will reassess their positions based on perceived strength rather than stated unity, which means the next moves matter more than the initial strike. Credibility will be measured not by what was done, but by what is enforced next week and next month. And if enforcement slips even briefly, the signal reverses, inviting challenge instead of deterrence. So the coming phase is about locking outcomes into routine, turning an exceptional action into a normalized reality. Because in power, politics permanence is achieved not through dramatic decisions, but through sustained, boring, unbreakable follow-through. What remains unresolved is retaliation risk, because even stripped of formal leverage, the displaced actor still retains informal networks, narrative reach, and the ability to inject instability at low cost, high visibility, which forces the system into a defensive posture it did not choose, but must now sustain, monitoring signals, countering disruptions, and preempting moves before they surface publicly. And this is where miscalculation becomes most likely, not from aggression, but from overreaction or fatigue, because maintaining heightened readiness drains political capital quickly. Yet any relaxation invites testing. So leadership is trapped in a narrow corridor where restraint and firmness must be perfectly balanced, knowing that one wrong move could either reignite the conflict or signal weakness to actors waiting for the next opening. The operational environment is now defined by uncertainty management, because clarity at the top does not translate into stability across the system. Every subordinate layer is interpreting the move through its own incentives, timelines, and fears, which creates uneven execution and fragmented signaling, if not tightly controlled. And that fragmentation is exactly what adversaries and internal challengers look for, probing for delays, contradictions, or fatigue. So enforcement shifts from a single decisive act into a continuous process of calibration, adjustment, and correction, where power is exercised quietly through access control, agenda setting, and exclusion rather than confrontation. And the success of this phase will determine whether the outcome hardens into a new equilibrium or slowly degrades into a contested gray zone where authority exists on paper but erodes in practice. The final pressure point is time, because the longer this phase stretches on, the more opportunities emerge for reversal, reframing, and gradual erosion of the outcome. Narratives will harden, counter-narratives will spread, and actors who stayed silent will eventually be forced to choose sides, which means momentum must be converted into permanence before attention shifts elsewhere. Institutional memory must be rewritten, so this decision becomes precedent rather than exception, and procedures must be normalized so they no longer feel extraordinary, because in high-stakes systems, power is not secured at the moment of rupture, but in the period that follows, when patience, discipline, and follow-through determine whether an event becomes history or merely the opening move in a longer confrontation. The silence is over, and what comes next will be louder, sharper, and harder to contain, because if the main actor is quiet tonight, it doesn't signal retreat. It signals calculation, a period of reassessment where options are mapped and pressure points identified. And the lesson learned today is brutal but clear. Systems tolerate disruption until they redesign themselves to eliminate it. After that point, leverage evaporates instantly. This story is far from finished. The vote is closed. The decision is locked. But the real conflict has shifted to what replaces the old order, who fills the vacuum, who controls the narrative, and who absorbs the cost. And that battle is only beginning, unfolding hour by hour, move by move, with consequences that will extend far beyond this single moment.